Hey, it's Adam, your internet chess coach. In today's video, we're going to look at game number 4 of Karpov versus Kamsky. Kamsky with the white pieces won against Karpov's Karakhan, so he's going to play it again. He goes e4, and Karpov plays c6, pawn d4, and pawn to d5. We have takes, and pawn c4, which is the same as game number 2, and it's the Panov attack. Knight f6, knight to c3, pawn to e6, and Kamsky plays knight f3. Karpov plays bishop e4, Gata takes, Karpov takes, and bishop d2. This is the exact same line we're looking at from game number 2, so we're going to find where is the improvement from Karpov. We have knight c6, bishop d3, castles, castles, and bishop e7. The idea of bishop e7 is potentially to transfer the bishop to f6, but it also stops this queen c2 temporarily, because if white were to play queen c2, then we have either knight to b4, hitting the queen and the bishop, probably this knight, keeping this knight installed on d5. So bishop e7 is played, and queen to e2 on the board, knight to f6. The threat is potentially bringing the queen to e4 and putting pressure on the h7 pawn. Something to note about these structures is that with the isolated pawn here, white needs to generate an attack, otherwise the pawn will be a long-term weakness and liability. Karpov plays knight f6. We have knight to e4, same as game number 2. And I think Karpov played queen c7 last time, and the queen was misplaced. I think, I forget exactly, queen c7. And let's see what he does this time. He goes queen b6, so hitting the pawn. And something to note is that the pawn is immune at the moment. And the idea is that if you take on d4, we take, queen takes, bishop c3. Let's say queen b6 or queen d5. We have knight takes, bishop takes, pawn takes, queen h5, or queen g4 first, actually even better, and then queen to h4 with a double attack. There's a long line here, but at the end of the variation, white is simply better. The rooks come to the open files, and black is in some big trouble with his lack of development here. So queen b6 played in the game, avoiding the capture on d4 and asking white what is he going to do. The pawn is under attack, but it looks very risky for black to take it. Kamsky plays a3. Now the pawn is completely poisoned. If you take rook to b1, traps the queen. We have bishop d7 by Karpov developing. Rook to d1, rook to d8. Knight takes. Bishop takes, and queen to e4, and pawn to g6. Now the best move here, according to the engine, is going bishop to h6. And the position is completely equal, and black can play either bishop d7 or go into an exchange sacrifice with knight takes d4. After, you can take back first with the knight. Bishop takes, we can take on f2 with check. And black has enough compensation. And if knight takes d4, we can also have this line, takes. I forget if it's rook takes or king takes, but rook takes. Knight takes on d4, and again bishop takes. And black has enough compensation for the exchange. He has a pawn and the bishop pair, and the bishop is actually going to be a very, very dominating piece in this position. So maybe Kamsky didn't want to go for this, and only black would have some chances there. So the question is, what does Kamsky do if you're not going to go bishop h6? You have a weakness on d4. Your pawn is under attack currently, and Kamsky plays bishop e3. Simply defending the pawn and preparing to play d5, hitting the queen and the knight. Karpov plays knight to e7. We have knight to e5, hitting the bishop. Karpov plays knight to f5, rerouting the knight, maybe keeping the king a little bit more stable with the knight covering some squares on the king side. The knight always has the ability to take the bishop as well, and the game looks very level. But in black's favor, I think, because this pawn is a weakness. Okay, Kamsky to play. What to do here? Do you take the bishop? Do you move your bishop? Do you defend the pawn? Do you push the pawn? Do you go d5 and try to open up this diagonal? It's really a question for white. What is his play here? He goes knight to c4, retreating the knight and hitting the queen. And we have queen to a6. Kind of a scary move, but bringing your queen on the same line as the bishop, but Karpov analyzed. There's no problem here. There's no real danger. We have pawn to a4. Now if the knight moves, the bishop cannot go to b5, which would be a nice idea to trade off this light squared bishop. We have bishop to c6, hitting the queen, and queen to f4. Bishop d5, centralizing the bishop, blocking the pawn, and hitting the knight. The knight moves, and the queen is hit. So the queen moves to b6. Okay, again, the question for white is, how is he supposed to make progress here? Black now has an installed bishop on d5. His king is a little bit weaker, but he still has this bishop. You can't go g4 here because g5 would trap the queen. Kamsky goes he doesn't go g4. He plays bishop takes f5. We have pawn takes f5. The structure, you could say, with these doubled pawns, it's a little bit weaker because the pawn on d5 potentially could push, but the bishop and rook are preventing the pawn from ever pushing in these types of positions. So, looking quite good for black here. We have rook to d2, bishop g7, pawn to h4. Kamsky really trying to make some progress here as white. All right, what to do here as black. The d7 square is a little bit vulnerable, but one move that comes to mind is rook to c8, taking over the open file. Maybe queen d6 as well, and then rook c8. Karpov plays rook to e8. Okay, rook c8, yeah, knight d7, so you can't play that first. So rook to e8. We have queen g3, rook to c8. Knight attacks the queen. Karpov moves to c6. We have knight to c5. Pawn b6, kicking away the knight, and knight to d3. The knight's doing a little merry-go-round here. And queen to d7, maybe trying to avoid any rook c1 with tempo. Also a very nice move centralizing the queen and asking black what is he going to do. The queen's also coming to the queen side as well. Might be useful at some point. We have pawn to a5, and this b5 square could be accessible for the queen, but we have rook to e4. What I find fascinating about this game is how Karpov's noticing weaknesses in his opponent's position. And not specifically pawns, but weak squares. So he's going after c2 and e4. Maybe c4 and b3 as well, and potentially the b5 square if the pawn moves forwards. We have a5 and rook to e4 with some really strong ideas of rook g4 and bishop takes or rook takes on g2. Kamsky stops his plan with knight to f4, and Karpov plays b5. Locking down the queen side, the pawn might be a weakness. c4 square and rook c4 and rook c2 are potential ideas in the position, putting pressure on d4. If the rook gets to c2, putting pressure on b2. And Kamsky plays a very nice move here, I think. Rook d1, consolidating his position. It does give away the c2 square, but he is connecting his rooks, and he's ready to challenge Karpov on the c-file. We have bishop to c4, maneuvering the bishop. A very interesting move, I think, because the bishop was dominating, but okay, after knight f4, he's keeping the bishop alive. Doesn't want to trade his light squared bishop here. We have rook to c1, pawn to h6, rook to c3, creating some serious threats with rook to c1 and b3. If you were black, how would you deal with this oncoming attack of rook to c1 followed by b3? Pause the video. Try to find the move here for black. Okay, welcome back. Karpov plays b4 first, attacking the rook, and after rook to c2, then rook to c6, intending on meeting any rook c1 with bishop to b5 or even bishop d5. We have rook to c1 anyways. We get bishop to b5, king to h2, and king to h7. Rook takes, bishop takes back, and rook to c4, hitting the pawn on b4. Okay, black to play. Your pawn is under attack. Do you push the pawn? Do you defend the pawn? Or do you create some other attack? Karpov plays bishop f8, keeping things simple, rerouting the bishop, defending the pawn, but also giving this bishop an idea of coming to the d6 square, potentially putting pressure on the queen. We have knight to d3, hitting the pawn again. Pawns defended once, but attacked twice. How would you protect this pawn or play here as black? Pause the video if needed. Karpov plays queen to e6, counterattacking, hitting the rook on c4. Very nice move. We have pawn d5, sacrificing the pawn, trying to open up this diagonal for the bishop. Karpov takes, attacking the rook. We get a rook trade. The bishop takes, attacking the knight, and bishop takes a7. Okay, my question here for you, if you want to work on your tactics, is an obvious move here for black is queen d7, hitting the knight and hitting the bishop. What did Kamsky have in mind if queen to d7 is played? If black goes queen d7, what did Kamsky have in mind? Okay, if queen d7 is played, Kamsky, being a phenomenal tactician, had this idea of bishop c5. And the point is, if you take here, you take here. And if you take here, then the knight is safe, and the knight will take back with a fork. So Karpov saw this, and now the question is, if you're not going to go queen d7, what are you going to do as black? So black to play here. What would you play? Okay, black plays bishop d6, hitting the queen. If pawn to f4, you're really not moves you want to make because the pawns are super weak and the queen's also passive. But maybe you had to go for this in the game. Kamsky goes knight to f4. He's putting his knight in as a pin, but hopefully he's thinking the bishop can block. Maybe the queen can move. You can kick this bishop away and get out of this pin somehow. You also have a pawn running down the board as well, and you're currently counterattacking the queen. But this move unfortunately failed to queen to e5, adding pressure to the knight. And after, in the game, what was played? Yeah, queen to e5 was played. And after knight to, the knight is simply under attack. And after knight to h3, now queen to e7. And a double attack, and it's game over. Okay, we also have one more tactical point. After queen to e5, what happens if bishop to e3? What should black play here? Well, for starters, you can take the pawn and keep all the threats alive. And you also have this move, queen to f6. Now you're unveiling the attack against the knight and the queen, and your threat is pawn g5, takes takes, and even if you give this check with the queen after king g7, or sorry, king g8, probably a slightly better move, the knight is simply pinned, and pawn will take the knight and win the game. So it was actually in this position after queen to e7, Kamsky throws in the towel, and Karpov wins with the black pieces game number 4. Okay, we're going to take a look at more games, game number 5, and see if Kamsky's going to choose a different opening as black. Game 6 will be Kamsky as white, so we're really going to see, is he going to go into Karpov's Caro-Kann and find an improvement? And where would that improvement be? Or is he going to change his opening entirely? The match continues. I hope you enjoyed today's video, and stay tuned for the next World Championship match coming soon. Bye for now.